Today we have a really great talk on two-factor authentication by Kelley Robinson. She works in the account security team at Twilio, helping developers manage and secure customer identity in their software applications. Please give her your respect and attention throughout her whole talk.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you all for joining. Apparently there was a mild projector issue earlier, so we're here now. I'm gonna go a little bit over my time, a little bit after 3, just so you know what to expect. So I've been thinking about this a lot in this last week. This was something that the security researcher Troy Hunt tweeted last week. For those of you that might not be familiar with Troy, he is the researcher behind the website haveibeenowned.com, who here uses that website. For those of you that did not raise your hand, definitely recommend checking this out later. It's a service that compiles data breach information and lets you know if your email address or password has been seen in a data breach. But I think this is a really interesting take because in 2020, the reality is we're so owned right now that we expect legitimate email addresses to have been seen in a data breach, right? We expect that you would have gotten owned at some point. I know I certainly have. I'm guessing if you're not lying, most of you also have as well. And that's not your fault, right? Like, it's a scary world out there. And while this isn't a talk about data storage security, there's still a lot of insecure password usage out there, and Troy Hunt's project proves that as much as we'd like to believe otherwise, simple passwords like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are still being used a lot. That password has been seen over 23 million times in data breaches and is still incredibly common. So this is what we're here to discuss today, this reality where we're so owned that passwords are no longer enough, how two-factor authentication or 2FA can help us stay more secure and help keep our companies and our customers more secure, and how we can evaluate all of the different options available for 2FA. So my name is Kelley Robinson. I work at Twilio. If you haven't come say hi at our booth, please do after this. If you are familiar with Authy or Authy users for the 2FA app, Twilio acquired Authy 5 years ago, and I work on the part of the business that includes Authy, our account security team. So I work on our APIs for things like phone and email verification and two-factor authentication. And I also spend a good amount of my time educating developers about security and especially identity and authentication concepts. And so this talk is going to incorporate a lot of the things that I've learned in the last 2.5 years working there and working with our customers on their authentication challenges. And the failure of good authentication often results in account takeover. And according to Javelin Study and Research from 2019, this is a $4 billion industry problem. And so this is why people are incentivized and why the industry is incentivized to solve this, because this is costing businesses a lot of money. It's costing people a lot of pain to have their accounts being broken into. So there's a lot of incentives to fix this problem. And one of the ways that we have classically authenticated people into our systems is with these different types of factors. Primarily, we're using the knowledge factor to prove your identity. And so this is the authentication factor that is something that you know, like a password. But in order to keep us more secure, we want to start adding additional factors. Anything that uses 2 or more of these different factors is what's known as two-factor authentication. And so you, in addition to the knowledge factor, also have the possession factor, which is something you have, like a mobile phone or a security key, and the inheritance factor, which is like biometric data like Face ID. Because we're focusing on the second factor, all of the things that we're going to talk about today have to do with this possession factor, and that's just because these are some of the most common types of 2FA available right now that we're going to be focusing on this. So let's talk about the different factors that we have available and talk about some of the benefits and downsides to these different factors, starting with everyone's favorite SMS-based one-time passwords. And so one of the reasons that people like this factor is because it's easy to onboard your customers. According to a recent Pew study, 99% of Americans have a mobile phone capable of receiving text messages. And that's huge. This makes companies want to add this channel because it's really easy to onboard your users. You don't have to make them do anything special. They already are capable and familiar with receiving these one-time codes via SMS. This is a factor that's been around for over a decade, and it's become so popular that people are familiar with this factor and are willing to use it. However, this is not a secure delivery mechanism for one-time passcodes. It's subject to man-in-the-middle attacks. People can get access to the codes that are being sent to you because SMS is not an encrypted channel, and there are ways that people can get access to those messages. One way that they can do that is through SS7 vulnerabilities. SS7 is the signaling system 7, and to condense an explanation of the vulnerability there, it basically is a vulnerability in the inter-carrier telecom switching that allows people to impersonate a carrier in order to get your messages routed to them. And so if I'm roaming, a carrier in another country, or someone impersonating a carrier in another country can say, hey, Kelly's actually in Colombia right now, why don't you send her messages to us? And that allows them to get access to my text messages. But arguably the more common thing that we're seeing right now is what's known as SIM swapping. And this is when people use social engineering or perhaps bribery of telecom agents to get access to my SIM card. So if you want to call up Verizon and tell them, hey, I'm Kelly, and I would like you to send a new SIM card to this address, or you go into a store and bribe an agent or successfully impersonate me in person, then you can get access to my text messages that way, and all of a sudden I'm cut off from everything that's being sent to my number. So SMS is a super convenient option, but it's not very secure. Another method that we have available is what's known as soft tokens, or TOTP, which stands for time-based one-time passcodes. These are a way to generate tokens based on an algorithm. The inputs to that algorithm are a secret key, a shared symmetric secret key, and the system time. And those get put through a one-way function that props out a truncated token. Symmetric key cryptography offers increased security compared to SMS, but if someone gets access to that shared secret, then the method is easily compromised. At a previous job, we had 2FA turned on for some of these shared engineering accounts, but we shared the QR code in the engineering Slack channels so that when new people joined the team, they could scan that and get the TOTP on their phone. This is not a horrible situation, but this is an example of how this type of factor could get compromised, because it's not device specific, it's not person specific, and so there is the ability for these types of secrets to be leaked. But it offers some distinct advantages because it's an algorithm that basically uses simple math and the inputs are do not require an internet connection. This is available offline, and it's also an open standard. So while this does require you to download an app, there's multiple apps that have implemented this standard. So anywhere that you see a Google Authenticator, like scan it with Google Authenticator, you can scan that with Duo, you can scan that with Authy, you can scan that with the TOTP app of your choice. Unfortunately, this does require the app download, and in a recent study of token usability, they found that 2/3 of participants who had issues, or who used TOTP, had issues entering the token before it expired. And so there might be some concerns about the usability there because of the expiration user experience. So this is a pretty good option, but it's not perfect. But we see a lot of security-conscious companies moving and adding TOTP as an option in order to delight their more security-conscious users. Another thing that I want to mention, because this is used in a study that I'm going to reference later, is the idea of pre-generated codes. And so this is something that a website would generate a set of usually backup tokens for you, and you would store those somewhere, up to you, and then you can use those in replacement of your 2FA methods. So this is easy to use. However, if anybody has ever implemented backup tokens or worked at a company that had backup tokens, you know that your users never store these. You know that they don't remember where they stored them, or if they emailed them to themselves, or if they ever noticed that this was an option that they could store the backup tokens to begin with. So this is a challenging thing because there isn't a standard way to give users to store the backup tokens. And 25% of users in this study that I've mentioned said that when they used a backup token, it didn't really feel like added security on top of just a password. So this is an option for backups. We'll debate later if it's a good option for backups, but it's less practical for ongoing use. Push authentication is another channel for two-factor authentication that we're seeing more popularized in recent years because of Duo Authenticator. And so users like this because it's so low friction. You can approve or deny a login request from your Apple Watch or from your phone. And it also uses asymmetric key cryptography, which uses two tokens, one of which the private key is only stored on your device, so it's device specific, it's user specific, it doesn't have the same shared secret leaking potential that TOTP has. You don't have to worry about that secret leaking like you might with TOTP. And this is the only form of 2FA that really offers a denial feedback, right? So the other ones, if you don't recognize that message, there's nothing that you can do about the fact that you're getting this request for 2FA login. However, with push authentication, you can build in actions based on denial, based on the fact that you might think somebody's trying to compromise an account. Unfortunately, this is so low friction that one of the common arguments against push authentication is that people see it as too easy to accidentally approve a request. So in the middle of the night, if somebody is trying to phish you, you might accidentally approve that request without meaning to, just to make your phone stop buzzing. I haven't found any research about how common that actually is, but that is something that people note as a concern with push authentication. But one of the notable downsides to push is that it does require a special proprietary app that could be built into your application if you are a mobile-first company or a company with a lot of mobile users. We've seen Google start to do this with any of the Google apps. They use it as a push authenticator to approve login requests from other devices. But you might also use something like Duo or like Authn in order to approve those requests, and this does require that somebody have an application of any kind on their phone, and users aren't always willing to download another app. So this seems great, it's cryptographically secure, but it might be too convenient, and there is the downside of getting people to download the additional application. This also will require some additional dev work that might be slightly more complicated than the adding of 2FA via SMS or TOTP. Finally, I want to talk about U2F, Universal Second Factors, and WebAuthn. WebAuthn is part of the new FIDO2 spec that is including a path towards a passwordless future. We're not talking about these as a password replacement right now. We're talking about these as password augmentation as a second factor too. And so I combine these to basically talk about things like security keys, like the Titan keys that Google's giving away. And these are great because they're phishing resistant. You don't have the ability to get those man-in-the-middle attacks. It uses asymmetric key cryptography, so it's tied both to the site specific and to the device that you are using and authenticating from. But it's also an open standard like TOTP, which means that a lot of people can go and implement the spec and add an authenticator that is compatible with WebAuthn. The biggest drawbacks right now is that this is kind of a new thing. Not everybody has implemented WebAuthn support yet, though it's becoming, I think, pretty standard across most major browsers. However, one of the biggest implementations of this right now are things like YubiKeys and like Google Titan keys, and it's not super reasonable to expect that everyone will have access to one of those unless you are at BSides and getting a free one from Google. These things cost about $50. You have to actually order one, and so these are things that you might want to consider if you're thinking about getting these for or supporting this for especially things like a consumer use case. As more devices that we already have, like our phones, become supported authenticators, and there's a lot of phones, like I think the iOS or iPhones just added support for this in like the last 3 months, but it's not as common right now, and as devices that we already have start to adopt this standard, we'll see this become more common. And we'll also see this become more common in places like in intra-companies and enterprise environments where you have used this for employee authentication. Because you have something like an IT department that can hand you a physical token during your onboarding, and you have an IT department that can handle the account recovery use case because they have details about who you are in the employment system. One of the drawbacks of using hardware security keys like this is that when you lose one, you might have a really hard time getting back into your account, depending on how the site has set it up to do the account recovery. So what I wanted to do was back up some of this more qualitative data with actual research. And there was this great study from 2019 that was presented at the Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security, SUPS, it's a great name for a conference. So this was presented last August. And the study focused on setting up and using these 5 factors that I just walked through. This is definitely a really interesting study. I've linked this in the references for this talk. I'll post the slides after if you want to read through the entire study. There's also a talk that they gave at SUPS where they kind of summarized their research on this. But let's talk about how to set up these different authentication tokens. Kind of surprisingly, the pre-generated codes were what they found were the fastest to set up, and that's because they did this for Google, and Google has a one-click button that says generate some codes for me. Unfortunately, the study didn't really take into account how the users would store these tokens long-term, and that wasn't part of the overall setup and usability considerations for measuring the usage of these tokens. So code storage was not considered, and like I mentioned before, 25% of the participants in this study said that these pre-generated codes didn't really feel like any added security. In a different study from 2018, focused just on YubiKeys, but for cross-platform setup, I think this was really interesting because the setup success was really different depending on the platform. So Google had 83% success, while Facebook had 32% success. And 2018 is like forever ago in terms of YubiKeys and hardware security tokens. A lot has changed since then, but I think this is a really interesting look at how onboarding users can affect their success in using a single type of authenticator. So one of the things that was really great about the Google setup is that they walked you through it step by step and made sure that users had success at every step along the way, and that's why there was much more success there. The documentation for setting it up with Facebook was more lacking, and so people were relying on a combination of documentation from the YubiKey website and from Facebook itself. So this is a really interesting look at how onboarding UX impacts user success, because you want to keep in mind that you have to have successful logins with these extra factors before you allow people to actually turn it on. And so people were ending up locking themselves out of Windows 10 computers because the Windows 10 computers didn't actually force them to use and to complete a successful authentication before they enabled the second factor. So moving on to usability, one measure of usability was the overall time that it took to authenticate, and unsurprisingly, universal second factors and push authentication, which require a single tap, were the fastest methods. They had the fastest median authentication times, and especially when it comes to compared to SMS, some Duo research from 2019 found that push saves the user 13 minutes annually, while U2F saves the user up to 18 minutes annually. And so this is going to save people time in the long run, if that's one thing that you want to consider in terms of keeping your users happy with authentication. A lot of people are concerned about adding 2FA because they think it slows down the signups, slows down the login process, and there's proof here that there's faster methods of authentication available. But another measure of usability was this idea of a system usability score or a system usability scale. And SUS or SUS is a common measure used by researchers to measure people's opinions on the usability of these different factors. And so despite the fact that a lot of people couldn't enter TOTP codes in this study on their first try, people actually liked TOTP the best. And I thought that was a really interesting finding here. And that's for the second factors. You might notice that they actually like just passwords. They like passwords without any 2FA the most. But that's not really what we're concerned about. For a second factor, TOTP was the most successful. But the usability scores for all of them were actually kind of high, which I think is promising. People are willing to use 2FA when they see it working for them. However, we mentioned the time to authenticate using some of these factors. There's somewhat of an inverse relationship here with how people felt about the factors versus how fast they were. So push and U2F were actually some of the lowest scored SUS scores, even though they were the fastest to authenticate. And so the researchers observed that faster authentication doesn't necessarily mean higher usability. So there are a lot of trade-offs here and a lot of levels of security in these options, but I think it's important to note that SMS-based 2FA is still better than no 2FA at all. This is really easy for me to say. I work at a company that does this, right? But there's more research on this to back me up. So in 2019, Google did this study that said that SMS 2FA effectively blocks 100% of automated bots, 96% of bulk phishing attacks, and 76% of targeted attacks. And so this is a really good way of measuring the effectiveness of adding this on top of just username and password. And even though targeted attacks still have an attack vector available to them, that's one thing that we can consider, but it's still better than nothing at all. Even for companies like Coinbase that mandate 2FA for their users, they still support SMS-based 2FA because they know that it's better than not supporting anything at all or allowing their users to get by without 2FA. But when you start looking at push authentication, there is increased protection. So it increases the bulk phishing attacks to 99% and protection of targeted attacks to 90%. So you have different options for your 2FA, but you also need to get your users to enable it for the added security. And so adoption of optional 2FA is something that's historically been abysmal. I read some research that said that Dropbox quoted that something like 1% of their users have turned on 2FA for Dropbox. And there's a few reasons behind the adoption for this. The BYU study that I've been mentioning found that people were willing to add 2FA if they saw the value in the account. But there were still 13% of the participants that just thought the inconvenience was too high. And so I think that we need to educate users about the importance of security here, but also make it easy for them to turn it on and make the options available to them to enable this seamless enough that they're going to see the value and going to make sure that they enable this at their convenience. Because a lot of people just believe that they're not a target. This was from another research participant. They said, I just don't think I have anything people would want to take from me, and so I think that's why I haven't been that concerned about it. And this might be true for some accounts, but depending on what your company is protecting, this is something that you want to consider of educating people about why they need to turn on 2FA and what they are protecting and how to incentivize them to do it. All hope is not lost. Awareness and adoption has almost doubled in the last 2 years. And so this is from some Duo research from last year. People that have heard of 2FA has increased to 77% as of 2019, and people that have used 2FA has increased to 53% in 2019.
We have 1 minute.
And websites are getting more savvy about how they're getting people to turn on 2FA. There's some options that you have available for this. So product incentives is one method for this. Does anybody know what the spike in 2018 is there? Fortnite. So Fortnite started incentivizing people to turn on 2FA, and it's really funny because even almost 2 years later, 3 of the top 5 related search queries to 2FA according to Google Trends have to do with Fortnite. Epic Games is who owns Fortnite. They aren't the only ones offering incentives. MailChimp offers a 10% discount for users that turn on 2FA as well. So there's things that you want to consider here, but you also need to measure your success. And the one thing that I want to point out here is that you want to make sure that your losses due to account takeovers are going down, but you also want to make sure that your support costs relative to those losses are also going down. And that could mean that your support costs are increasing, but that's a calculated decision that you want to make in order to support the added security for your customers. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution here, but the advice that I end up giving most folks boils down to this: you want to delight your most security-conscious users and provide some options for the rest. Because, like the security researcher Cormac Hurley says, when we exaggerate all dangers, we simply train users to ignore us. I hope I've given you some inspiration for how to think about your authentication systems. Come find me after this if you have any questions. I will be up at the Twilio booth. Once again, my name is Kelley Robinson, and thank you for listening.